lovely and darling viewers, it's Jen here at Check Her Joy. This time I'm reviewing Shoot for the Moon, The Space Race, and the Extraordinary Voyage of Apollo 11. It is written by James Donovan. I actually listened to the audiobook for this, which is narrated by Allan Robertson. But, also I got the physical copy out of the library when I came back. I love it. It's a little easier for me to review books when I can, hold them and flip through them. So this is a nonfiction overview of the U.S. space program and everything that had to happen before and up to Apollo 11 so that we could land on the moon and beat the Russians, basically. There is a lot of politics that happened. There's a lot of science that had to happen and things we had to figure out that we'd never done before. Not only as, Americans, but also just in general, humanity had never done these things. It does a good job of balancing both the human aspect of who was involved working at NASA, working for the Russians, the politicians who were involved, tons and tons of behind-the-scenes things. So there's 400,000 people who were involved in NASA and the space program to get us to the moon. And this really looks at all of the stuff that had to happen, all the things that had to go right, and some of the failures that happened along the way. And it's pretty easy read. I really loved the human aspect and getting to hear stories about the astronauts and the technicians and the engineers and the astronauts' wives. So it does go through all the science that we had to figure out. So it goes through the early days of rocketry, especially focusing on Vernon von Braun, who was the main engineer of the V-2 rocket. He was a Nazi working on that from Germany. And then World War II ended. He defected to the U.S., kind of for asylum. And then he starts working on our U.S. space programming and is the lead engineer working on the Saturn V rocket, which is what they actually took to the moon. So we get to see all the stages there about what work he was doing for the Nazis, why he actually defected, and then what he did when he was here. Some of the weird things that happened was that he became this celebrity. So he became the face of, rocket science. Basically, he was doing all these television programs with Disney. So a lot of kids were learning about rocket science from this former Nazi. Then it also takes us to the Mercury program, how we have the famous Mercury 7, these 7 astronauts that everybody was paying attention to. They became massive celebrities. And then how they weren't making much money from NASA, so they ended up with this side contract from Life magazine, who then followed them around, and they were making the big bucks from magazine to be celebrities, and so that Life could have exclusives about the space program and their everyday lives and how their wives and their families got involved with that. So it takes us through all the stuff we had to learn in Mercury when we're first figuring out, can we even get into orbit? Can a human survive in space at all? Once you have to keep building better rockets so you can go farther and farther. If your goal is to go to the moon, you have to be able to get a rocket that's going to get you out of Earth's atmosphere first, and then second, figure out how you're going to propel yourself from Earth's orbit into the moon. So all the steps they had to go through. And they also went through the Gemini program and all the different steps they had to learn in Gemini. When they started adding more than just the first 7 astronauts, they had 2 other astronaut classes. Astronauts that joined, all the different Gemini missions. One of the missions was Neil Armstrong, and he did the first docking in space with having to connect to this. So basically they sent up 2 rockets, and one was just a machine that was orbiting, and then the Gemini rocket actually had to connect to it so they could dock, because they were going to do the rendezvous to get to the moon. So they had to figure out how to do that first. They had to figure out if they could spacewalk. How do we make the spacewalks easier? Because they're super exhausting the first times they did it. They're hey, we can survive outside the spaceship, but it wasn't very efficient. So how do we get it so we can spend several hours outside the spaceship? Really all the different kinks they had to get through. And then it also deals, there's tons of personal stuff as well. Talking about astronauts like John Glenn, who became super famous. He was one of the Mercury 7, but he was the most at ease talking in front of the press. So he becomes kind of the star. He's also very serious and very studious. So while some of the other astronauts are off gallivanting, off cheating on their wives, driving fast cars. John Glenn's really like, okay, so what are we going to do about the space program? This is my goal, is to get into space, and isn't as distracted, and how he's much more like, it was interesting to see the contrast in how the different astronauts react, even when they start adding in more pools and getting more astronauts into the space program. Like, each of them have like a different personalities and how they manifest when you're under that much pressure, where you're working so hard. But then you also have the celebrity status where everybody's paying attention to you, and there are definitely a lot of girls who would love to hang out with and sleep with astronauts. So I found some of those stories really entertaining and interesting. And then Deke Slayton is also a Mercury 7 astronaut that becomes important because he ends up getting grounded for a medical reason, so he's not allowed to do any more missions where he's an astronaut. So rather than give up and like quit NASA, he ends up becoming the manager in charge of the other astronauts. So he's like the trainer, the person who's in charge of assigning what crews are going to be on which missions, and ultimately deciding which crews are going to be like the first to do things, particularly the first people to land on the moon. I also found it interesting to see how we really didn't know what we were doing in Mercury at first, so we're kind of just winging it, and how much influence the Mercury 7 astronauts had, because they were all pilots. They were all, I think, test pilots or fighter pilots, so they'd been in planes, they knew how to fly, and so while NASA's like, well, we can just make it all automated, we can all control it from the ground, the Mercury 7 astronauts are really pushing for, yeah, we don't want to just be passengers, we're pilots, we would like to fly in space. Like, we don't want to just be in space, we want to actually be active in this. And so they were pushing to be able to fly, and having the way that the spaceship was set up, and trying to make the controls very similar to planes, because that's how they operated. That's what they're used to. Like, so a lot of the design elements were influenced by those astronauts themselves. And then eventually we do get into the Apollo missions. It's really sad, but also kind of surprising that the first major failure that the first major failure that NASA had was Apollo 1, which was not even actual launch. So when they were doing one of the pre-tests, they were doing a plugs out test, so they weren't completely powered up. They were just checking to make sure everything was working, getting the astronauts used to being in their capsule at the top of this rocket, and like going through checks. So the astronauts got stuck in the capsule at the same time that there was a fire, so they couldn't get out. So we ended up losing 3 of the astronauts on the ground, just during a regular, what should have been a routine check. So this ends up setting back NASA and really making NASA stop and think what they're doing. They were rushing so hard to just beat the Soviet Union, like, just get it done quickly, we need this stuff by this time, that some of the safety checks were getting skipped, some of the things like how the door opened weren't quite as safe as they could have been. So like the door was supposed to push inward, but because they had pressurized the capsule with like a really high oxygen content, I think it was 100% oxygen, they couldn't open the door because there's more pressure inside than outside, so they couldn't get out because of the way that the door opened. So they had to, and there were also bolts that they had to like actually unscrew, and when you're strapped into a seat and you're on fire, that's not an easy thing to do. So it was a complete disaster. So then NASA really had to stop, think, reevaluate, come up with new solutions. How do we make this safer? How do we make sure this doesn't happen again? So balancing epic disaster that everybody basically saw with let's make it safer for the next time. But even then, there's so much risk involved. Like the Mercury astronauts, they did not think they were going to get through Mercury without a death. They thought at least one of those astronauts, one of those missions was going to be such a huge failure, and they weren't going to all come back. So the fact that even Mercury and Gemini went off without any major catastrophes, like the only astronauts they had lost were people who were flying planes on Earth, is really miraculous. They also were checking in with what was happening with Russia. So a big push in the space program, it's a space race because we're trying to beat Russia. So the Russians always beating us, or when we managed to finally beat the Russians at something, it became a huge deal. So the Russians got the first satellite up in space. It was the first man-made object in space with Sputnik 1, and how that really kicked our butts into gear. And then they got the first humans into space. They had the first couple humans, they had the first female astronaut at a time when we're not even really considering female astronauts. Like, it was something they had discussed in NASA but had decided not to do. So Russia had the first female astronaut. She even came back and had babies after going in space to prove that, like, which ended up proving that it was, that space wasn't doing anything to her reproductive system. She had a baby with another astronaut who had also been to space. So, like, their babies were fine, which is pretty cool. And then he also went through the animals that went into space before we finally sent humans. One of them was Leica, who is a Russian dog who makes it into space, comes back, and then because they didn't get to the capsule fast enough to let the dog out, it ends up dying in the capsule back on Earth from overheat and stress, which is really sucks. Also, some of the other rockets, I think there was one with a monkey that went up in space, but the monkey, like, completely was freaking out the entire time. Like, they put it through simulation training, done it with the G-forces and the spinning simulators, but when you actually are in a rocket, it's completely different. And you're also a monkey, so no, you don't honestly know what people are doing to you. So I found the animals also interesting, but also a little bit heartbreaking because they're not animals, they can't really consent. So it does a good job of getting into the interesting parts without glossing over the bad parts of the space program. And then eventually we get to the Apollo 11 mission, which is like a good chunk of the end of the book, going through the actual guidance computer and how it's like hand woven. So like it's this computer that was amazing at the time because it was one of the first like really compact microcomputers. It was still like the size of a briefcase. So it was still not as small as we're used to now, and it has such small computing capabilities, but all they needed to do was have the guidance computer work. And so they came up with a system that even if like all the power shut down, the rocket completely lost power, if they could get it back on, they could still use the computer because they had hand woven the programming in using zeros and ones, whether or not something went through a like loop or not. So I found that really interesting. They basically knit the computer together. So that was a bunch of ladies, little old ladies, just knitting the computer that went to the moon. So the guidance computer I found really interesting. But there's a lot of stuff going on with Apollo 11, dealing with engineers, the people who are in ground control, who are in Houston, and then also talking about the three astronauts, talking about Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, and their backgrounds, what missions they'd been on before. They were all experienced astronauts who had been in space before Apollo 11, which is one of the reasons why they had been picked. And then there's also like a little bit of a tussle between Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong about who was going to be first on the moon. Typically in that kind of scenario, like the person who was in command would have stayed in the ship while the other person went out. But because it was the moon landing and such a high prestige thing, and because of the way they were sitting in the capsule, which, you know, could have been changed, Neil Armstrong, who's the commander and has more experience, gets to be first on the moon, and get to hear about Buzz kind of having a conniption about that and how he really wanted to be first. So I listened to the audiobook, but I also checked out the physical book, which has some photographs in it as well. So we've got Sputnik and Leica the dog, and here's the V2, which is the rocket Germany was working on. And then there's another section about like the middle space stuff, and some of those early flights and people. And then a third section of photos, which really focuses on just Apollo 11, the moon, which is obviously the big finale, the big, hey, we did it, we made it to the moon first. I really loved how in-depth this got and how casual, like, I was listening to an audiobook, so it went pretty fast. And it's pretty easy to understand, and I'm just kind of bummed that it just stopped at Apollo 11, because I want to know about the other space missions now. So if James Donovan wants to write more about NASA and keep going with Apollo 12 on, I would love to read that. Or if anybody else can manage this. I love sci-fi, but I also really love like actual history of things that we've done. And being on the moon is pretty much a massively huge. I mean, being on the moon is such a big part of like we did something amazing, and really looking at like the politics of that time and like how we wouldn't have gotten there that fast if all this other stuff wasn't happening at the same time. If, you know, Kennedy hadn't set that mandate by the end of the decade, if the space race with Russia weren't happening at all, if we didn't have Werner von Braun, a former Nazi, coming over and bringing over his team of other rocket scientists from Germany. Like all the things that had to happen for this to succeed, all the different missions that had to come before it, all the different astronauts, all the training they had to do. So I really enjoyed this one. I definitely recommend it. So I ended up giving this 4 stars, and maybe the 5 stars is not unwarranted, now that I've actually reviewed it. But I did highly enjoy this, and I do recommend Shoot for the Moon by James Donovan. Let me know in the comments below if you've read this. What other books about NASA or the Apollo missions do you recommend? I've also been reading other books about the moon landing because the 50th anniversary, so I'll post the links to those down in the description below as well as I get those reviews up. One of them is No Dream is Too High by Buzz Aldrin, which is like his life advice, but some of them are anecdotes about space. I've also reviewed Hidden Figures about the women of the female computers at NASA, and I'm currently reading Moonbound, which is a graphic novel, basically covering a lot of this stuff, but much quicker and with pictures. So I'm enjoying that. So I'll post those reviews down there when I get them up. So peace out, I love you guys, and keep reading. Bye!